For the struggle against international finance, we had Pedro from Ecuador. What an inspiration. And the Bolivians inspiring us for the climate struggle. But can we think of a more inspiring revolutionary precedent than the Cuban revolution of Che Guevara and the Cuban health revolution of Aleida Guevara? What inspiration. And for autonomism, in South Africa, we always look to Zapatismo as inspiring. And then Vinod will tell us the mass movements of India in a moment too. So we'll quickly say what our struggles in South Africa. We had this amazing anti-apartheid struggle, but now there's social resistance in post-apartheid South Africa. We have a capitalist crisis. We have more protests than anywhere in the world per person, although China is close by. China is very, very close. And we have a water struggle, an AIDS medicine struggle. Those are the quick things, and they're in a document that will be on their website from the current review of radical political economics. And this is South Africa, and the old apartheid was the cut up area of very bad quality land where 1/2 of the people were put, all of the black people, on 13% of the land. This was the racial apartheid, the Swiss cheese of the bad land and the mass of the people in the reserve army of labor camps, the Bantustans, where rural women would reproduce very inexpensive black male labor for the corporations, for the mines, for the factories, for the plantations. And now we have post-apartheid South Africa, but this is class apartheid. This is the same systems of migrant labor, although labor rates are lower. The workforce is cheaper, partly because of immigration, of migrants, of refugees. And we still have this extreme poverty. 1/2 of the people are poor. So we have to explain apartheid, and the intellectuals have given us a great many ideas. Liberals, of course, said apartheid was irrational and that the capitalist system would get rid of it. Didn't quite happen that way. So we had many theories. The Communist Party, Third Internationalist tradition, colonialism of a special type. I mentioned last night articulations of modes of production, capitalism working with the pre-capitalist to exploit labor and super-exploit women. Then some Poulantzas followers said, oh, but it's fractions of capital that you must understand. And then racial capitalism. Then we had the E.P. Thompson tradition, history from below, social history. The French influence that we were talking about with Pedro's discussions of the regulationists, and then a minerals energy complex, uneven development, lots of ideas. But I think I can come to some quick history to give you the sense that the 1930s, when there was very rapid growth, occurred through deglobalization, the development of industry in South Africa during the Great Depression worldwide, because of the lack of trading and finance that gave South Africa a chance to develop. And then we had slowing growth and decline, globalization, and the world stagnation. Do you remember last night I showed you that the world economy was going slower and slower per person growth? Even the World Bank admits, except for China, but the rest of the world slowing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s today. And the profit rate declines that we saw from the US examples last night, again reflected in South Africa. And this we would call an over-accumulation crisis. Partly it's globally over-determined, but it's also locally organic to overproductive capital for a small, mainly white consumer base. And then the mass of the black population oppressed. And even the attempts to give credit, I'll show you, didn't work. So then we went from neoliberalism, we went from apartheid to neoliberalism. And the reason that we could get rid of apartheid was partly that economic crisis because of the sanctions against apartheid. That's where I learned my politics. When I was a student of David Harvey, and this was our most exciting solidarity struggle. And I found I could do my PhD about Zimbabwe next door and then moved to South Africa. It was so impressive to see the world struggle against capital and capital support. And then that meant that the new white president in 1989 he had to move away from securocrats, the fascist police, to econocrats, the fascist neoliberal economists, right? And that meant moving away from the inward economy with the border zones and low interest rates and subsidies. The IMF said, no, you must get rid of that. So they were beginning to give advice in 1989. And then with that high interest rate, the longest depression, and the white regime needed to get rid of the formal racism in order to get more legitimacy. And they privatized, the IMF said, a value-added tax. And then we had the World Bank parachute in. They had reconnaissance missions in every area of the economy and the society in the early 1990s. And even the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, trying to get a big, broad coalition against apartheid, made alliances with big business, Anglo-American Corporation and all of its allies. And then we had the apartheid debt. The money that was borrowed by the old regime was ultimately repaid. Nelson Mandela said, well, we should repay that, then we have a good reputation. And I worked for Mandela in 1994 and wrote the first white paper. And the balance of forces was terrible because the Constitution gave the Reserve Bank independence, meaning they can just set the interest rate in favor of the banks. The IMF came in with a huge loan just before independence. And even the manager of the IMF, do you remember the managing director? I don't mean that other French pervert, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, I mean Michel Camdessus. But he told Nelson Mandela, you must reappoint the white finance minister and the white central bank governor. This is well known, that the IMF managed this transition. And then we had the GATT, then the WTO, adjudicate that South Africa must drop lots of its import protections. And then exchange controls were lifted, because that was part of the deal. White people could take away their money. And then we had currency crashes, and then we had the end of our reconstruction and development program. And then we became more unequal. Is that true? South Africa today is more unequal than during apartheid. That is true. Isn't that shocking? That is disgusting. And then we had unemployment doubling. And we have houses and water, sanitation, electricity that is inferior or more expensive than during apartheid. The environment is worse, even the government admits. We've had a depletion of our non-renewable resources, and GDP growth does not reflect that. We've had the bubbling of finance, insurance, real estate, and the decline of manufacturing. Textiles, footwear, even gold mining shrinking. We've had a stagnation of private investment because of the persistent overaccumulation. The currency is even more unstable than during nearly the revolution of the mid-1980s. We've had 5 currency crashes and another one last month. We've had the highest interest rates in the country's history. And in fact, today only Greece has a higher interest rate than South Africa. We've had an economy that grows with the rise of private credit, this bubble economy, thanks to middle-class consumption and especially mortgages, that is, housing loans, because the consumer debt has gone up to incredible levels. This reminds you of the United States, eh? Same thing. And the levels are so high that now people cannot pay their debt. The non-performing loans have been soaring. And that's especially dangerous because we've had the largest bubble in real estate in the world. South Africa was 389% increase. So construction has been driving economic growth with finance. But this is unsustainable, and now the house prices are crashing. And we've had this capital strike because the biggest companies in South Africa, Anglo-American, De Beers, Old Mutual, South African Breweries, Investec, Didata, Gencor, Liberty Life, all ran away to London. They were allowed to escape and take their money. The general trend of overinvestment that started in the 1970s still continues, so huge underutilization. And as the money flows out of the country, foreign debt rises, so we have a debt of over $100 billion. Nelson Mandela inherited $25 billion. And you see that line going down, that's the money flowing away to the big corporations. This is the current account deficit. It's so bad that The Economist magazine rated South Africa the riskiest of the emerging markets 2 years ago. Okay, so that's the context. Now, the resistance, protests, lots of protests. They look the same as during apartheid. This was against the soccer stadium. Did you see the World Cup? Right? People were angry. We spent maybe 140 billion rand, more or less the same in local currency here, to build these beautiful stadiums. But people were not happy because that meant no water, no electricity. I'll show you some of the exact protests. So we have a lot of protests, roughly 10,000 per year. You see them on the TV screens all the time in South Africa. The police measurements are up to about 10,000. Now, I just found in China you have 100,000. Very, very competitive people, I know. But you do have 1.4 billion people, right? We only have 50 million. So we're ahead. So the Chinese must catch up, right? Our team is winning in the protests. We try to think of these partly as logical when there's neoliberalism, as Karl Polanyi shows, a double movement. There's always some reaction against that neoliberalism. But I think because 50 years ago this month, the world lost the most brilliant analyst of post-colonial Africa. He died very early, age 32. But Frantz Fanon wrote in The Wretched of the Earth this context of understanding neoliberal nationalists, that the national bourgeoisie is quite content with the role of the Western bourgeoisie's business agent, plays a part without any complexes in a most dignified manner. And this is the sort of general problem for the South African ruling class as a comprador class. We have a little phrase in South Africa: they can talk left, but they walk right. Many learned their Marxism at the Lenin Institute in Moscow. Very good students. Thabo Mbeki, the best student ever there. I was reliably informed. But when it comes to issues like delivery to ordinary people, it's not happening. So that's why there's so many protests. So if we look at water, when people resist uneven development and water commodification in Soweto, they first protest in the streets, but then they say, well, wait, we have a constitution. It's beautiful. Everyone has the right to an environment not harmful to their health or well-being. Everyone has the right of access to sufficient water. So the people said in Soweto, let's take this promise to the courts. We'll go to the High Court and the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court against the privatization of water in Johannesburg, the biggest third world privatization contract at the time. And Suez, the French company, was designing the privatized system that limited the amount of water. There's a little bit of free water, 25 liters. That's flushing the toilet 2 times, that's all. So the activists said, no, we want to have double that, 50. And then the High Court said yes. But then finally in October 2009, the very final decision, no, you don't get double the water. You only get your 2 flushes per person. Then the next question was, well, how is it delivered? And the French company Suez says, you must pay first, prepayment meter. And the activists said, no, we want the same as in the white neighborhoods, a credit meter. And the first court said, that's true. The prepayment meters in the black area, that's discriminatory. The final court, the Constitutional Court, they said, no, it's okay to have prepayment. So you see the limits of liberal capitalist democracy, rights talk, the limits of the most advanced constitution for human rights to give socio-economic rights actually isn't very impressive. So we understood the limits there, that we need to have a framing of the commons. And I think the way Ariel Sally put it this morning was absolutely right. We were so anthropocentric in thinking that water was just about the consumption by a household, and we left out the rights of nature, the question of where the water comes from in the Lesotho dams and where it goes to in the disposal systems, and the right of a water system to reproduce. We also learned that you can use these rights for defensive purposes. You can stop disconnections of water, but we also learned, as the critical legal theorist put it, these are rights that are contingent. They're based on the balance of forces. They're not foundational. We don't believe in some liberal conception that human rights talk will solve all our problems. We use it for social education, for mobilization. I'll mention the successful one. But if you want to get real relief, the social activists have taught us, you have to reconnect. You have to common. Commoning is, well, some may call it stealing, but that means you reconnect, even if it's illegal. This woman here has got a connection meter. She throws away the meter, and now the meter is not just called a statue. It just sits there, but underneath the water pipes or the electricity wires are still running. And the activists defend these households. And this, in many areas, is the majority, as people are commoning, as the prices go up. The second study, to conclude, is the most inspiring, because I think since 1994, aside from the revolutions in the Andes, this is maybe the most advanced form of social activism we have seen in the world, and it has saved more lives. And Gugu Dlamini lost her life, and she was advocating AIDS education in Umlazi, in Durban, where I live, and she was stoned to death. She was stoned to death by her neighbors because of the stigmatization of AIDS. She was HIV positive, and this was so difficult 11, 12 years ago, because if you wanted to get medicines to stop HIV from killing you, you needed